Bruce Kogut is the next speaker. He is professor at INSEAD. Bruce Kogut is professor of strategy and management at INSEAD until December 2002. He was the Dr. Felix Denman Professor at the Wharton School University of Pennsylvania, where he headed the Reginald H. Jones Center. Bruce Kogut has been a visitor at the École Polytechnique, Stockholm School of Economics, Wissenschaftszentrum, and Santa Fe Institute. He works in the area of international direct investment, development economics, technological policy, and privatization. He recently finished a report for the World Bank reviewing their privatization policy in East and Central Europe. In 2003, Peter Cornelius, now senior economist, Shell Corporation, MD, published an edited book on corporation governance and international capital flows. This was edited by Oxford University Press, which was presented at the 2003 meetings of the World Economic Forum. His edited book, The Global Internet Economy, was also published in 2003. In addition, he is the director of a new research initiative at the European Institute of Advanced Studies in Management and of a non-profit school in Paris. So I am sure that this is not enough to represent you, Bruce, but you can add the remaining information. I leave the floor to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It's always interesting to hear people give your biography, which has some correlation to the truth, and that was well done. I'm an American living in Paris now for a few years, and is this? Be closer. So I was about to say, I know that I've talked in Italy a few times before, and I believe I was told that for every English word, Italian uses 3 words. So I'm not sure where the interpreter is. I guess it's over there. But if I start seeing her get very upset, I would suspect that I'm talking too fast. But it's a bit difficult because I was born in New York, and we tend to speak very quickly in New York City. It's a pleasure to be here. I think part of the reason I'm here is because I had the pleasure of hearing Roberto Serra talk in Brussels some time ago, and he gave an excellent exposition about complexity, and I was very pleased to have a chance to come here and talk as well. I wanted to start off by also acknowledging a colleague in the audience, Pietro Urso. Perhaps you can raise your hand, Pietro. He is very much a co-author, co-producer of this work, which we'll discuss today, and he's currently at Bocconi University in Milan. It was a great pleasure to hear John Casti talk. I think John knows that I'm a fan of his work. I even brought my John Casti book. He says a little old, but that's because I bought it, John. I was not from a used bookstore. I actually paid you some royalties on this one. I have a few other ones of his, and I do admire book writers. It's nice to hear that you have to write 5 books before it gets easy. So I'll keep that in mind as I approach 1 or 2 on that task. But it was great to hear him talk, and I think he said many things which were quite useful for our discussion, particularly about the differences between complexity, being complicated, the way it's being used across business and business schools. I was at a school where Forrester talked, so I knew system dynamics rather well. I remember when I first arrived as a student, I heard Forrester talk to all of us about the use of his approach and how you have to keep 100 differential equations in your mind at the same time. And I thought that was a rather difficult thing to do, so I did not study it in great detail past that. But it is often asked, what is the difference between these approaches? And very often we're asked to give very bold explanations and claims. The truth of the matter is that a lot of what's done in complexity shows up in many different areas. If you look today at classical economics, There are many ideas from complexity which are being used. Agent-based modeling is increasingly being used in the context of economics. Some of the early work done on the internet and network externalities, the externalities of people all using the internet, relied very heavily upon these notions. And if you look at current work, you see that much of the mathematical technology is very close to what's being used traditionally in complexity. So I don't think we have to defend this. In some sense, the battle is over. It's diffused. The only problem is, in some sense, maybe saying, well, this is, who did this and where did this come from, or is this complexity, or is this economics, or is this strategy? But the truth is that this is already a very successful revolution which is being used. I think where it's difficult in this area of business is the following. I was asked, I'm going to be joining Columbia University over the next few months, and I was asked to teach a class called Strategy. And I have not taught strategy, even though it's in my title, for about 15 or plus years. In fact, it's the first class I taught was finance, another one was strategy, and that was the last time I taught the strategy part. So I was looked at over it, was taught, and I've done work in the area research-wise, but not actually face an MBA audience. And things have changed an awful lot. But one of the things you notice about strategy, whether it's in a business school or it's McKinsey or it's being used in a firm, is that you often see pictures being used, very simple pictures. So the one everyone knows is the BCG cash cow. In fact, John, you missed your line when you talked about your New Zealand business. That's an example of a cash cow sort of strategy which you were describing. There's also other cash cows called Parmalat, but sometimes that cow gets cashed out a little bit too much as well. So, but we use this framework, and it's kind of embarrassing because colleagues come by and they see a cow on the board or they see a star, but a lot of the work is just done visually. And I think that's what you were very honest about. There's mathematics, and actually behind the BCG matrix, there's economics, there's economies of scale, there's notions of market demand driving increasing returns. There are many things behind that which are interesting, but visually it's actually quite simple. And I think that's part of the power. So when I look at a book like this one here, which is a very beautiful book, and I see this graph, this network graph, and I say, boy, this is gorgeous. It's got color, it's got, nodes, it's got links. And this is part of the power, is the fact that many of the ideas which we have can be represented very, very beautifully, very powerfully by visual techniques. So this is one of the great parts of what the things we do. I was looking at YouTube recently, which is a great emergent technology. It'd be interesting to see whether anyone actually earns money off YouTube commercially. And I was looking at this thing about Steve Jobs from Apple. And Steve Jobs is such an amazing person. And he's got a few things on YouTube. One of them was what he felt about Microsoft. And this is a few years back, and you say, well, Microsoft, stole my operating system. They stole my visualization, all my icons and that stuff, And he says, but I don't mind that stuff, The only thing I really mind is that Microsoft has such bad taste, So it was kind of a personal statement. And that's somewhat true, because a lot of complexity has to do with design and the world of design and how we present data and the quality of which we present data. And I think this is a bit of art as well as science. We all do this when we think about these issues. And this is part of the background as well. So when you look at these graphs, these BCG matrices, it certainly is a design issue. It's a way to understand these things, and hopefully it tells you some truth as well in these issues. But what I was trying to think through was how to make more use of this, actually. And I will say, I think we are challenged to take more of these tools and to use them in business in a more effective way. I was part of the group of people who worked on things called real options, the option pricing models used in strategy. And I, at the time, worked with McKinsey, who had a very large practice on this. And McKinsey actually killed their practice. I don't think there is now a real options group at McKinsey, but because it did not in many ways speak to the businesses. So when I looked at your insurance things which you put up, it's easy in some sense to view this as kind of an options contingent risk sort of a framework. But you have to somehow build that into a way which can be used by people in some sense. And that again is a challenge for us to think through. And as you said earlier, the person who does the mathematics and complexity will be quite famous, the Newton of complexity. But also the person who just simply takes these ideas and can visualize them and make them tool-like, also I think will be making a great contribution. Some of the best people doing this have been people who have been coming from the popular press. I'm thinking of Malcolm Gladwell's book on the tipping point, which was so powerful, which was frustrating to many people because it was so simple and everything was known, and yet he was the one who put it together with such beautiful ideas to make it useful. So we're not there yet. So what I thought I would do today is give you a sense, a little bit of how we're doing some research on this. I wasn't sure how much of the audience would be research, how much would be from industry. So it's a bit of both. I will try to talk about some of the cultural things which were brought up, which I think are quite relevant. And give you a sense of an overall view of how this is being used, and hopefully we have some time for questions. Maybe you can tell me when we have about 10 minutes left. So maybe tell me 10, and that'll be very helpful to me. Okay. I'm not sure if you can see this clearly enough. You can, I think. The screen's big enough. There's a case on Swiss Air. Swiss Air was an airline which has now been revived. You know, Swiss Air was not supposed to go bankrupt. It's Switzerland. Is known for its banks. It's known for very solid, machinery, very expensive jewelry. And then this airline goes bankrupt, which is kind of embarrassing. Now, and I'm not sure if this is a failure of not seeing the world correctly or not understanding complexity. But you have these very nice graphs which look at the world. These are the alliances between airlines. And what you can't see too well is on the upper left-hand corner. The upper left-hand corner, there is Lufthansa, and there's also located there Swiss Air, and they form kind of a cluster together. And then down below you have Delta, and thank you. And down below you have Delta, and I think you have American Airlines, which is forming. And they're doing deals as well. Now, this is again the Delta, and this here is Swiss Air, and you have other players as well. And you see the network changing dynamically over time. And this is happening, and they're not thinking too carefully. And this here is the situation in 1998. This here is the arrival of Lufthansa and Air France. This here is Delta. This is over here Swiss Air. And down below is the growing alliances around American Airlines. So you have here an alliance structure. Now, I should have brought you 1999, but actually I don't have to. All I have to show you is that you can see that Swiss Air is a little vulnerable. If Delta simply switches partners, it's going to be in a disconnected part of the graph. We'll have no one to belong to. In fact, that's what Delta did. Delta switched over into this alliance the next year, and suddenly Swiss Air was left by itself with no major European player. Simple thing, very simple network graph to look at, which cost the company its life. It went bankrupt 2 years later because it was no longer being fed the passengers coming in from the U.S. So it's a very simple example of how visualization might be useful in order to look at. I'm going to tell you a bit of a structure of the talk here. I'm going to go through. I'm going to say a few things about how we try to see the world. I'm going to give you a lot of data, if you wish. I'm not going to give you too many models, but I'll give you a sense of what kind of models we use. I'll tell you about a few of the people who we look at. I will talk to you a little bit about this work here, which might make sense to you, and discuss some of the cultural aspects. And then we'll talk about some of the dynamics, particularly looking at venture capital. And I thought it might be fun to look at some of the rule changes, the changes of rules, looking at women coming on corporate boards, which would be kind of fun to see, and then talk about the future very briefly. Okay? This is some of the popular books which have come out over the past years. There's many other books which we can put out, including all the books which are written by John's colleagues at Santa Fe and other places. In fact, it amazes me, John, how quick physicists and computer scientists have got in the commercial instinct, and as soon as they got a good idea, they got a book already written on it. So there's clear value in this. But there's a lot of discussion around the long tail discussions, which often is the 80-20 rule, where 20% of your customers generate 80% of your business. In stock markets, John already talked to you about some of the financial findings in stock markets, how the very long tail actually generates most of the business. In the bookstores, Amazon does not make its money off the cheap stuff we all buy. It makes its money off the very few books which have very high demand, but is very limited in supply. I don't think that's the case, John, for your book, but I'm sure it's still popular on the popular bestseller list. But for the rest, we pay a lot of money for what we really want. This book came out by my colleague at Stanford, Kathleen Eisenhart, on competing on the edge of chaos, which is a good Santa Fe term. Her author at that time was Shona Brown, who is now at Google and runs one of their big strategy efforts over at Google itself. So that's not a testimony of complexity mattering to business, I would say. Probably nothing is. Kim Clark and Carla Baldwin are colleagues at Harvard. Kim now was the dean of the Harvard Business School, which talked about how very simple rules generate design, particularly in the computer business, and also around ideas of modularity, which become quite critical. So this is often used quite a bit with notions of criticality, design, and structure being the ones which come up. Now, we know that in science, there's a lot of tremendous work which speaks to this, and many of you are experts on this. One of the big differences between science and social science is that there's a lot more people doing science than there's doing social science. I don't think that's entirely appreciated, that there's just so many people in science who are working on these areas. So if you get to a very narrow area of science, neuroscience, you go to their conferences, there's thousands of people. You go to the all of economics, the American Economic Association, all of economics is 20,000 members, and that includes everyone, from macro to micro to monetary. So there's a lot of work which is being done, and I think that's often what's so impressive is the rate of change, which is so critical. So you look at work done by Jeff West, who has his new book coming out with David Lane as the editor, and Roberto has a chapter or else is very prominent in the index to that book. It's due by July 15th, but I'm sure July 30th will be as good as we could be good too. And Jeff, he looked at these sort of these log relationships between the mass of an animal, and this is the metabolism rate. I found this incredible sort of relationship. This has been done, Jeff tells me, also for city size and the speed of walking. So for small cities, people walk very slow. As you get larger and larger cities, people walk faster, and that scales in a log fashion. So I think of New York, where I'm going to, and I am amazed by how fast people walk. Of course, there's a lot of particle collision as well going on in New York, but it's slower in other places. And Jeff, he worked with this old approach in biology, looking at the actual transfer of blood, communication of blood, and tried to derive the models which would explain these patterns. This is the same thing done for the growth of cells. This was not done too much in economics. Actually, there's a funny history to it where it's been used, but it has been used recently. So you get sort of people looking at the growth rates of companies, and you don't find quite the same relationship we saw before, but we see something here which has this pyramid shape, this tent-looking shape, and when you scale it correctly, you find that this thing holds very well across years. It holds extremely well across countries. Now, I should point out, though, I'm not sure about Italy, because I know Italy has one of those strange distributions of firms, which was not the standard one across most countries. But I'm not sure how it looks for this particular graph. But all what I'm trying to show here, without trying to explain it too much, is that you take some data across countries, across time, and you plot that, and you see the same shape. come up over and over again. This is the pattern, and you kind of wonder what's going on. This is actually growth rates. Now, this has been done for stock prices as well, which was referred to earlier, or for the volume of trading. And you find these log linear relationships, often looking like power laws or something like that, again, which is very robust across many situations. The people who did this, Stanley is a physicist, actually worked with one of my colleagues when I was a PhD student, Michael Salinger at Boston University. They looked at very low correlations to explain this. A great economist, John Sutton at the London School of Economics, said, look, you can even have independent businesses inside a company, all growing at different growth rates, and this by itself will also generate this particular pattern. The observation I'm trying to make here is that you observe an empirical pattern, and then you try to tell a story, a model, which explains this actual use. So it's, again, looking at data, which is quite critical. One of the reasons why complexity is now being used a lot more, even in strategy, is because we now have a lot more data than we did before. We have a lot less data than we want. But we, Pedro and I, are working on a project, which I'll show you in a second, which says, what looks at patent data. Patent data is used widely these days, and you can see why. Because you can get it available easily, and there's many things you can do with patents to order to get a sense of the patterns. So there's a lot of data which is available to us. It's electronic. It can be collected. Often it's middle-sized numbers, so we can actually start looking at these issues. This here is a graph which looks at Russia. Now, this is one of the things which surprises me. What this basically means, this is a log rank, and looks at the asset size. And the biggest firms have a lot of assets, and many firms don't have much assets at all. This is the exact sort of pattern you expect to see in capitalist countries. This is the sort of pattern you expect where a few companies dominate very strongly. What's kind of interesting about this is that this emerged, to use the language earlier, this pattern emerged within 10 years in Russia. Within 10 years, you had the founding of hundreds of banks in Russia, all the same size, all competing against each other. And within 10 years' time, you find a distribution of asset size which is identical to the distribution you find in Western countries. And that to me is astronomical. I mean, it's this incredible power of competition in the market, and a tremendous statement on there's something fundamental going on in these markets, which is generating the same pattern across all countries. This is done for the year 2000. This is after the collapse of long-term credit capital. This is after the collapse of the Russian economy. So even with a big stochastic hit of a collapsed exchange rate, you still find this pattern holding up. This is not a distribution. This is a chart here which showed up in the Journal of Economic Literature. And it may seem funny to you, this chart, but this chart is used by the World Bank and the IMF to say that there's a problem in some countries. And there is a problem in many countries, but I'm not sure this chart is the right one. This chart gives you the share of billion-dollar wealth to GNP. So if you look at China, oddly enough, you probably have read that there's some very rich people in China these days, extraordinarily rich. Or if you look at India, the Ambani family in India, which owns Reliance, etc., is worth quite a bit. They're a huge portion of the GNP of India. So you see this sort of distribution on this. But the truth is, and we've done this, if you take the growth rates of China and India, and you get the right initial conditions, and you look at the overall mean growth rates, you get the mean and the variance, you can generate out this kind of pattern. Because with very high variance of growth and very high growth levels, you're going to generate some people who are going to be extremely wealthy to the population itself. Now, that doesn't explain why certain people are wealthy. I'm not saying that explains why certain people in Italy are wealthier than other people. You may need theories of politics, etc., to explain that. But in terms of a pattern, we can explain that by very simple models of growth. So this is sort of pattern looking at patterns and trying to make sense, which is very important. We can often give many models, so we want to look at things which find cases where we reject them. And we often do this by looking at sort of toy models. Now, I don't want to use up too much time here, and you may have seen this before, so let me do this to a certain extent and give you a sense of what's happening, because I want to talk more about venture capital. This is a book put out by Duncan Watts, who is an Australian Navy officer who came to Cornell, where you freeze most of the year. It's so cold. So the only thing you can do is actually work. So he worked very hard, and he wrote a great thesis, which came out in a book with his, a lot of his work was done with Steve Strogatz there. Duncan was very young. You know who Eddie Murphy is? Eddie Murphy? So the American comedian. Eddie Murphy became successful very young. And he said it's wonderful to be successful when you're young and at the height of your sexual powers. For Duncan Watts as well, I mean, it's not quite Eddie Murphy's fame, but very young guy, very intelligent, height of his intellectual and sexual powers at the same time. And he wrote this book, which had basically two parameters: clustering, which is a measure of clubs, you know, how many friends are friends with each other. So clustering is simply the clubs which exist in Italy or exist in Germany or France or anywhere, and how far apart we are from each other. So the famous story is, if you want to send a letter to someone, you don't know this person, and you have to send it off to this person. You usually send it to Roberto, because I know him, and Roberto sends it to someone else, and you look at how long it takes for the letter to get to each other. That's a sense of the length between any two people in the world. So a small world is going to be a world where there are people or have friends who know each other. That's high clustering, and the world is going to be rather small in terms of distances. It's going to be easy to get from one place to the next in this small world. Now, this is a little bit complicated, but it just repeats what I said to you. If you take a clustering measure up here, the clustering measure is high, and the length one, this is length here, is short. A small world is a case when clustering is big and the length is short. This is a small world area. As you take this network of all these connections of people, and as you move the links around of who knows who, and you randomize these links, what you find is that the length falls first towards a random sort of distribution, and the clustering is more robust. So this is kind of good news, and I may state this to you in a way which I'll show you in a second. The good news is that it means that in a world of globalization, even with a lot of investments coming into Italy, because Italy is such a big club, it means probably Italy is not going to change that much over a period of time. The length may change, but the clustering, the clubbiness won't change too much. So we actually did this for the case of Germany. We looked at a network of companies who own each other. There's cross ties in Germany. This is a former minister in Germany who talked about private equity as locusts, as grasshoppers, as cavalletta, I think is the correct word for that. So they were going to eat Germany up. They are still eating Germany. The private equity is still doing quite well. And Mr. Schroeder, who's smiling, I guess he was about to be named to the board of Gazprom, so he's a very happy man. So the issue was Germany going to change? And Schroeder lowered the capital gains tax to 0, so suddenly firms have an incentive to sell their shares. So there was a prediction that Germany is going to change very dramatically. Private equity would buy you. There's no capital gains if you sell, so the world's going to change very quickly. Now, a lot of places look this way. This is my cultural statement. This here is Mexico. Carlos Slim is now the richest man in the world, and Carlos sits right about there. This is his empire built around himself. This is Mexico. These are firms, the nodes of firms that ties their ownership. This, I believe, is Brazil, which is more small world-like. It's more small world-like because you see clusters in Brazil, and the path lanes are fairly short among them. So what we want to do is we want to say, is the world going to change very much? So you build a little model, and you very simple model in this case, and you see how things change, And this is what we did for Germany. We took the German network and we simply said, well, let's rewire, let's change the links in a random way and see how things actually matter. And when we did that, we found that this is the clustering and this is the initial clustering and length values. This is the empirical values. And now you randomize the network. And as you randomize the network, you find the length one is pretty consistent. It's not changed too much. That's because Germany is already a small world and is already on that flat part of the curve. But the clustering value does begin to fall, and as you change it to 192 changes, you start seeing some changes, but you only lost about 40% of the clustering value of Germany. So you would have to have a rather massive invasion of Germany in terms of foreign capital to make it change. And we've built now more precise models to show who's going to buy whom and what's the likelihood of you being sold or you being bought. But by and large, Germany has not changed that much, and that's true for many countries. So I'm going to see I have to go a little faster than I want here. I'm going to do this quickly. Some people do not like this approach because if you notice, it's very static. Takes the network, randomizes. A lot of things grow over time. So let's look at growing networks instead of static networks and get a sense. So the fellow who did this is a fellow named Barabasi. He took a lot of mathematics which already existed and put it to work. But he's an interesting fellow. He wrote a book which has done very well in the market. And what he said to Duncan Watts, he said, Duncan, problem with your network is it's not social. You assume that everything's got the same number of friends, but actually we differ in our number of friends. Now, one way to understand this is work done on sexual partners. So this is a study done from the island of Gotland. I'm not sure if you've ever been to Gotland, but it's a small island off the Swedish coast, a bit like Trinity off Bari. I'm trying to say this island off Bari. And people know each other, so it's kind of an intimate place. And this is data of women and men. This is their number of sexual partners. Now, 10 to the 0, I think, is a very low number. 10 to the 1 is not a very big number, but I think this is annual data for 1 year, so it's not like over your lifetime. And most people are up here, and there's a few people who are actually rather active on the small island of Gotland. But you can see, that you have this kind of power law approach, which says this person's got a lot more partners than this person up here. So Duncan Watts's model is not a good model. His model assumed everyone has the same sexual partners. In fact, they actually don't. So we have to think about this differently. One of the ways you do this is through preferential attachment. So, how much people want to actually deal with each other. And we want to look at this issue. So preferential attachment might mean that if I want to do a deal in Italy, I go to the richest person in Italy. So I knock on the door of Mr. Berlusconi. I'm sure there's many other rich people in Italy, but he's the one who comes to mind. And I knock on his door and say, I want to do a deal with you, Mr. Berlusconi. The problem is that everyone runs to him and says, I want to do a deal with you. So he's got all these deals going on. And there's many people who don't have any deals. So Mr. Berlusconi is preferential. People prefer to deal with him than other people. And this generates this particular pattern. So we want to think about how this actually matters. This is an example of what John called rules, where rules generate structure. So over here is a simple example. This is a network which was not connected, and now we're growing structure. We're growing links between them randomly, and over here we're growing them preferentially. And in the preferential way, you can see that a few nodes are going to have a lot more links than other nodes going on. So this is a case of a growing network, a rule which is generating structure, and the rule for the case of preferential is going to generate what's this power law sort of relationship. We looked at the venture capital data to get a sense that this is true. This here is from a firm called Alpinvest. Alpinvest is a large Dutch pension fund. This is Alpinvest. That's their first partner. Around them is their second partners. It looks like poppy seeds. And one of the complaints of Alpinvest, even though it's very big, is that they don't get into the deal structure. They're kind of passively receiving deals, but they actually don't get into the good deal structures themselves. So they want to know how they actually go out and do that. Now, I'm not sure this is going to work, but this is a map. I'm going to say C. So this did not work. No, I think I'm not going to show you this movie. So it's too bad because it's a beautiful movie. Here, I'll try it out. It's too pretty, so I'll choose the movie over just cutting off some things. This is the movie of the venture capital industry in the U.S. and they're doing deals over time. Can you see this? Do you see any lights? You see any reds or blues? Over there you see a little bit of red here showing up. You see things happening. You see a little blue here. Can you see that a little bit? A little bit. Something's happening. It's too bad. On my screen it's quite beautiful. So this is the movie of venture capital over time. It's been played over across 40 years. And now you see it a bit more. This is the East Coast. This is California. These red is investors. These are targets. This is Florida. This is over Texas here. And you dynamically see money flowing across the U.S. This is a simulation model which shows the explosion of venture capital over a period of time. And what you can't see very well is this whole area now is actually lit up. This is about 200,000 transactions. This, by the way, is a financial market. It's the same thing as the data earlier. This is a financial market. It just happens to be one which is actually private, and it explodes. And what we want to explain is actually who's the one who's going to get the money, who's going to do with deals with each other. So I'm sorry, we're back here, okay? So this is what we want to explain, and what we wanted to look at is the actual case of venture capital. Venture capital has a structure where companies invest in each other. So this is Sequoia, which invests in Yahoo, and Goldman, which invests in Google, which means that these two companies are partners because both of them have invested in Google itself. And we want to explain when do these companies choose these targets, when do they become partners with each other. So one of the natural things to do is to say, why would Sequoia and Goldman do a deal with each other? So we did a very simple sort of empirics. Empirics was to plot the relationship. And you say, well, maybe certain firms have preferential attachment. But in fact, they're not preferential because this is not linear. So we could reject this as a hypothesis. So preferential was not going on in our database. Instead, what we looked at was loyalty. That is the tendency of some players to do deals with each other over and over again. And when you look at loyalty instead of preferential, what you get is, in fact, this relationship. All this is basically is that it's not so much the case of promiscuity. Remember I showed you the Gotland Island? I showed you that this one woman had 12 to 13 partners. Well, some people say, well, look, she's not having more sex than me. You know, she just has more partners. Actually, I have my life, I'm sexually active, but I'm very loyal to my partner. I hope this is appropriate language to use. I'm moving back to the U.S., so this is the last time I can talk about this publicly, so I'm getting this out of my system. So this is the case of being able to have having the same partner, being loyal, but the number of sexual events. And what this shows is venture capital is extremely loyal, is that they tend to do deals over and over again with each other. So Sequoia and Goldman are constantly doing deals with each other, and poor Alpinvest is being left aside. We can show you, this is a study done by Hochberg at NYU, that the degree to which you're in the deal structure, where you're in the first primary deal structure, will determine your profits. You'll be more profitable as a VC company if you actually are located in the deal structure itself. And what we can show you, I'm quite sure, is that loyalty itself is one of the big ways which determines profitability in this industry. Finally, what we say we should do, we take these rules, and these rules could be different. I'm sorry I missed the cultural discussion earlier, but these rules could be different. We actually estimate the parameter values, how important is preferential, how important is loyalty, and then we take the population of VC companies and we start to simulate their deals going across each other. These are new firms coming in, so we can actually simulate the growth of venture capital over time. And Pietro will be doing this for the Northern Italy case over the next few years to see how this actually looks in the case of Northern Italy. Okay? My last thing, and then I'll stop, and I apologize for going a little fast here, but I'm showing you this, I'm playing here again with empirical patterns, looking at some rules, building some models around that, and then doing estimations. The last one is just for fun, and that is the world changing? And all our data on corporate governance shows the world is not changing very much for women. Women remain about 7% of board members in Europe. So if you look at board members across Europe, it's only about 7% are women. I think, if I'm correct, that women are about 50% of the overall population. I think it's how it works, but only 7% of boards, so there's some gap which has to be explained. And one of the nice things about this approach is that you can think about the future. I know John does this in a much more complicated way in insurance, but we can do this in very simple ways. And say, what happens if the world should change? What happens if cultural rules should actually change over a period of time? So we took the case of Belgium, and we looked at changes in rules, and we said, well, imagine that Belgium, like Norway, has a requirement that 20% of the boards have to be female, just 20%. What's going to happen? Now 20% is still less than 50%, but there aren't that many women who actually have the experience of upper management who could be chosen. So it's interesting to think about what could happen. So we use a measure called centrality. Centrality just measures whether a person is an A or a person is D. Obviously A is much more powerful than being D. So all I'm going to show you is a measurement of how central are these people given these changes. And then we do these simulations. We take the Belgian boards and we say, what happens if you randomly choose a woman? Or what happens if you follow a rule which says, look, I turn to Roberto and say, Roberto, we need a woman on our board. I don't know anyone. Tell me, who do you know? And Roberto says, well, why don't you use the woman on our board? She's very good. So I use the friend of a friend rule. I choose Roberto's friend to put onto my board. So we have two rules going on, a random rule plus a rule of friend of friend. These are like cultural rules, and you can play this differently across countries. Now this is an ugly chart. I'm very sorry for it. But this is for men. The top man in Belgium is a guy named Etienne Davignon. Davignon is a famous guy in the EU, the Davignon Plan, etc., and so on. And then you do it here for the case of the women, and you find that for the women, you find a number of people who come up. There's actually real names. We're missing a few of the names here, but some of the names are people who, of course, exist. And we could say, this is not hypothetical, we can say, this woman, under this rule, is going to be the most powerful person in the Belgian economy. And if you look at the centrality measures which we have, this is the random one down here, and then you look at the random is not particularly strong for a woman in terms of centrality, but if you look at the other ones, particularly the ones of borrowing a friend of a friend, women come out as much more central than men. So if you use this rule of borrowing friends, women are going to be much more central, even though 20% are going to have far more power than men, even at levels of 20%, because they're going to be on far more boards on average than the men will be themselves. Two last things, and I will end. So what this gets to is thinking about the future. And I think this is actually quite interesting to think about the future. And I agree with John. This is one of the great things about it. There's a fascination in this literature with this so-called NK model, which I've not tried to talk about. But it's simply a landscape. This is like the mountains the hills of Tuscany, where you have various peaks, and you want to get to the highest peak, but unfortunately you're stuck on this peak over here. So it's a sense of hill climbing issues, and the issue is how much information you have. And if you have local information, obviously you don't know that's a bigger peak. And there's lots of models which try to say how do you move from a local peak to a high peak. That's sort of the models which are being used. The big problem with these models is that they're extremely static. It's very hard to get change. Things don't happen very much. In other words, you don't get much innovation occurring. There's very low levels of innovation. And that's a big problem with most of the models we do. So I'm going to give here an advertisement for an approach which seems to get around this. And I'm smart enough to say, I'll let Roberto tell you about this. I hope he gives you his time to tell you. But there's some very interesting work being done which tells you ways how you can move from this peak here to a better peak through kind of more innovative techniques, which I find to be quite fascinating. So complexity is many things. It's a metaphor, edge of the chaos, tipping points, long tails. This has already been adopted in business. There's no reason to defend complexity. This is already standard work now done in business. I think in terms of a methodology, it looks for patterns, which is being done much more in marketing or in finance, increasingly so in strategy and management. Looks for patterns of the data, tries to find ways to model it, and also uses visual tools. I'm sorry my Hollywood movie was not good enough to wow you, but I guarantee you when the lights are off, it's quite impressive to see the U.S. explode in color with the venture capital growth. And you saw the graph of Alpinvest. Alpinvest liked that graph so much they can put it into their annual report as a way of showing what they actual do. And finally, for many of us, the nice thing about complexity is it's a way of thinking about the future. I like the language of possible worlds, where you can explore things and say, I don't have to even just do a risk assessment, which is what John was talking about, which is also important. But maybe I also want to change the world and think about if I change a rule or if I modify behaviors, how that generates different structures. And to me, that is perhaps the most exciting part of the area of complexity. Thanks very much.
So we have some minutes for questions before the coffee break. Please. Wait the microphone for the interpreter, please. Thank you.
I enjoyed your talk.
Thank you.
I find it very interesting. Since I spent 26 years in Norway, I'm actually a Norwegian citizen, and I was interested in using Norway as an example because they made this legislation. I think, though, in fact, the fact that they actually made the legislation has a lot to do with the fact that they've had a very, very strong economic growth, and they are very, very good at managing the national resources that they have. So they have a kind of economic policy which permits the emergence of the possibility of these kind of laws actually having, or these kind of regulations having some kind of effect, because I don't think you can impose very much from top down those things if there's not some kind of already, let's say, desire, which is created by education, amongst other things, also by the way people relate to one another and their self-identity and things like that. So there's a big relationship between top-down and bottom-up processes in those kinds of situations and in economic conditions in the country, the way the country sees itself as an economic manager. Another thing I wanted to ask you about was, for example, in the case of Italy, you have a lot, also in Europe, there's quite a lot of submerged economic activity, like immigrants who don't pay taxes, illegal immigrants, they send money home by transfers, etc., etc. Do you model these kind of things? Have you tried modeling these kind of things? There's the mafia in Italy, which is quite well known. There's also the Catholic Church, which at one time in history was the richest, but it's not generally considered a business, but they have a lot of banks.
Right, no, so these are great questions. I'll see if I can ask them very, very quickly. First place, I have a little knowledge of the general area of Norway. My wife is Swedish. I know that's not Norwegian. I know there's differences between the two of them, but it's not surprising in some sense that you get this top-down push, because the truth of the matter is, despite the reputation of Scandinavia, the bottom-up has not been working very well, which is kind of interesting about the whole the Scandinavia. So they put in this overall law, but the interesting thing about the modeling, when you model, you have to make choices about what you do. So you have to assume, is there an infinite supply of women to be called as directors? That's probably not reasonable. Is it finite? If it's finite, where are they going to come from? So when you start to think through the modeling choices, you say, well, probably they're going to come from other boards. So, and then you look at the structure and you say, well, it's given that, it's very likely that a few people in Norway a few women will be very powerful. In fact, we do have data on Norway. We will run the simulation, and I'll tell you who will come up as quite important. If you look at American boards, this shows up even in the work by Watts or Mark Newman when they did the more empirical statements. The person who had the highest importance in American boards was Vernon Jordan, who was an Afro-American. Because every board said, I need an Afro-American, I need to have someone there. And they said, well, use Vernon. We know Vernon, he's on our board. So he became the most powerful person on boards over a period of time. This stuff can be used for immigrant networks as well. It's been done already. What I find very exciting about it is that it challenges a lot of the notions. So, this debate in the U.S. about immigration, which is not a bad debate, because there's clearly problems with immigration, which no matter where you come from, the left or the right, we understand now there are problems with immigration. But this guy, Doug Macy at University of Pennsylvania, did a study and said, the funny thing about many of the Mexicans is that they don't want to stay in the U.S. anyhow. Their network is across borders, and they go back to their countries. So in terms of the long-term demographic changes, it's not so clear that the person from North Africa actually wants to stay living in a slum outside of Milan. That person might want to go back to North Africa. So I think some more modeling of the life cycle dimensions of immigration will cast better light on some of the policy discussions which we have, and these tools are perfect for that.
Thank you. Any other question? Thank you.
It seems that the same people tend to ask questions.
It's the power
there is a pattern here. Okay, first of all, a comment. Thank you very much.
It's very degenerate, but yes,
Thank you for stressing the role of networks. I just want to remark that within Cetra we have different ideas about what to teach about complexity, but networks play a central role, and the module which has been developed so far is exactly the one on networks, so that's completely agree. Then the question. I very much liked your emphasis on data and on the relationship between models and data. Most of the data which you showed refer to, say, large-scale phenomena.
Right.
The question is there any similar thing on a smaller scale, say within a single firm or a group of firms, which can be used in this way?
This has been done, and it can be done more and better. And there's some very good people who do this work in Italy, also in the U.S. I know that the semiconductor company in Italy, Andrea, Microelectronics, collected data internally to look at their activities inside and look at innovation patterns as well. And it's been done a lot in the U.S. too. A person's name comes up to mind is Morten Hansen, who's now at INSEAD, used to be at HBS, who had data on a company which is probably Hewlett-Packard. And it's not surprising that actually computer science departments want to hire him these days, because they have these great models of internet search, but they don't have great models of how do you find experts inside a corporation, or how do you form teams, how do you cooperate. And that's the sort of data you actually need. The cheap data is emails. You've seen that stuff being used. But the more interesting data is the personal connections. But increasingly firms are allowing you to do this, to come in to do these studies. So one of the big people in the field is a guy named Ron Burt, who does this work, who actually left Chicago for a few years, worked for a company with the contract that he'll collect overtime data on them, and now has been using this data in some of his analysis. The big problem is data collection is more difficult when you move away from things which don't obviously leave electronic traces. So we're all looking for an electronic trace, an email or a patent or something. So if you don't have that, then how do you get the data? Questionnaires is used, and sometimes it's good, but there's some problems with it. But the second problem to it is many of these studies are static, where the real interesting questions are the dynamics over time. So that's why the work with Pedro is interesting, is because as you build up more dynamic models of people coming in, people leaving their organization, links being formed, links not being formed, and trying to figure out the performance consequences, I think then we'll have a much better view of how networks and the complexity can be used inside of a corporation. That's still very new. In my view, it's still rather new, Roberto, and more could be done.
Thank you. Any other question? Okay, we are... Sorry.
No, okay.
Thank you
no
very much.
question. We have two good news. One news is that there is the coffee break in the hall. And the other is that we organized an internet corner to my right in order to allow you the use of electronic posta, mail, okay. And we have also a computer with the course on network. We build during our project, and you can enjoy the course. Some of the arguments has been introduced by Bruce, and thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bruce, thank you very much.
And I hope to my translators, I hope it was not too fast, so it's okay.
Well, we are a little bit late, so as a chairman I will be fired, but that's not a big problem. We have a coffee break. It's much better. It was much better, I think, to listen to these interesting things, and we try to reduce the coffee break to